The lights of Hollywood never sleep, but how many of its stars died, still guarding a secret they couldn't name? Behind every perfect smile and glittering red carpet, there were stolen glances, hidden letters, and hearts beating quietly behind locked doors. These weren't publicity romances. They were forbidden vows whispered between takes, hidden from a world that only wanted the illusion of love. How far would you go to protect the one person who made you feel human in a town built on lies? Some of them risked everything: careers, families, even their legacies, just to keep one truth untouched. They were adored by millions, but belonged to no one. And when the curtain fell, they took their real stories with them. These are the secrets Hollywood never filmed, the loves that lived in silence and died that way too. 15. Amy Winehouse. The stage lights loved her. The cameras adored her. But fame, for Amy Winehouse, was never a spotlight, it was a cage with no door. She sang about heartbreak, as if it were oxygen, turned pain into poetry, and let the world mistake destruction for authenticity. Yet, behind the mascara tears and tabloid chaos, there was a tenderness. No one ever saw a love story that existed in the quiet, away from the noise, and died with her before anyone even knew it had begun. He wasn't a star. He didn't belong to the orbit of managers, journalists, and hangers-on that surrounded her. He was just a musician, anonymous, grounded, someone who never asked for more than her company. In her journals, she called him "my shadow." He was the calm after her storms, the person who reminded her that Amy, the woman, still existed beneath Amy the myth. They'd meet in hidden cafes in Camden, talk about Billie Holiday and Motown, and disappear before the paparazzi could smell blood. The world demanded that Amy's life be chaos. It needed her tragedy more than her peace, so she learned to keep the peace secret even from herself. When asked once if she'd ever been truly in love, she laughed and said, "Yes, but he was smart enough not to love me back." When she died, the tabloids wrote the ending they wanted: addiction, downfall, wasted genius. But her mother found a folded page in one of her notebooks. On it, a single sentence written in shaky ink: "He kept me alive longer than I wanted to be." The press called her story a cautionary tale. They were wrong. It was a love story, one the world never got to hear, because Amy Winehouse, for once in her life, kept something just for herself. 14. David Bowie. David Bowie was made of light and disguise, a man who reinvented himself every time the world tried to understand him. He turned alienation into art, loneliness into spectacle, and desire into language. But for all his shapes and names, there was one version of Bowie the world never saw: the man who loved quietly, without costume or applause. In Berlin, during the late 70s, when he fled fame to rebuild himself among gray skies and cold streets, Bowie found what he called "my sanity in exile." There, he met a photographer who captured not Ziggy Stardust, not the thin white Duke, but David Jones, the human underneath the stardust. Their relationship was never labeled, never spoken of, never acknowledged. He visited her flat after midnight, where the only light came from candles and an old record player humming Nina Simone. She took pictures that no one has ever seen, rolls of film locked away, moments of stillness that fame could never counterfeit. He wrote about her in sketches, in notes hidden between lyrics. "You are the mirror that doesn't lie," one read. When he left Berlin, he told her not to wait. She didn't. But every few years, a package would arrive at his home, sent from Germany. Inside, a single photograph of the night sky. No note, no name. When Bowie married Iman, he found a love that was public, celebrated, beautiful. But those close to him said that sometimes, when he spoke about Berlin, his voice softened. There was always one unfinished thought, something he wanted to say, then didn't. After his death, one of those photographs was found in a drawer in his New York studio. On the back, written in his handwriting, were 3 words: "We never ended." David Bowie built his legend by transforming himself again and again. But maybe the truest version of him was the one that never made it to the stage, the man in Berlin, unmasked, illuminated only by candlelight, whispering love into a world that was never meant to hear it. 13. Dolores del Rio. Dolores del Rio moved through the Silver Age of Hollywood like a vision too graceful to touch, too perfect to be real. Her beauty was the kind that silenced rooms, the kind that made directors forget their scripts. Yet the woman who seemed sculpted from light was never truly seen. Beneath the jewels and gowns, Dolores carried a secret. The cameras could never capture a love story painted in shadows and whispers, hidden behind the colors of her homeland. It began in the mid-30s, when Hollywood started to turn cold. The industry adored her face but never forgave her accent. She returned to Mexico, her pride wounded but her spirit unbroken. There, she met a painter known only as Raphael, a man who saw her not as an icon, but as a living canvas. He painted her not for fame, but for devotion. Their affair unfolded in studios that smelled of turpentine and jasmine, in afternoons blurred by sunlight and longing. They never appeared together in public. He was married, she was watched. But through every painting, every brushstroke, Raphael left a trace of their love-hidden symbols, initials buried in shadows, her eyes painted not with glamour, but with truth. Over the years, those paintings scattered across private collections, unsigned, unclaimed. Yet anyone who looked closely could see her there, captured not as a star, but as a woman who had stopped performing. In her final years, long after her name had turned to legend, one of those paintings found its way back to her. She kept it near her bedside, a quiet secret glowing in oil and silence. Visitors said she would touch its frame before she slept, whispering something in Spanish too soft to catch. When Dolores del Rio died, the painting vanished again, perhaps sold, perhaps hidden, perhaps buried with her. But those who knew her swore she never looked more alive than in that portrait. It was the only time she was not acting. It was the only time she was loved without an audience. 12. Eartha Kitt. Eartha Kitt lived like she was born from fire. Her voice purred through microphones, seductive and dangerous, every note dipped in defiance. To the world, she was untouchable, the woman who could charm kings, mock presidents, and still make loneliness sound elegant. But behind that sparkle, there was a softness she never let the cameras find, a secret love that belonged to no biography, a story she carried like a perfume only she could smell. In the glittering haze of post-war Paris, when jazz was rebellion and skin color was still a cage, Eartha met him, a French diplomat with kind eyes and a dangerous job. He was married, older, accustomed to discretion. Their first meeting lasted hours. Their last would echo across decades. They fell into a rhythm of secrecy, late-night cafes, letters written in code, kisses traded for silence. He called her mon orage, my storm. She called him, my home I can't live in. When she returned to America, the love became legend in private. White orchids began arriving every year on her birthday, never signed, never explained. She'd smile when they appeared, touch their petals, and say softly, he remembers. Only her daughter knew they came from Paris. Her public life was chaos, blacklisted by the White House, silenced by the country she'd once sung for. But in the quiet of her dressing rooms, Eartha wrote his initials inside her lyric sheets, small and hidden, like prayers. Years later, when she performed C'est si bon, she changed one line, just for him. No one noticed, but he would have. When Eartha Kitt died on Christmas Day, the world mourned the legend. But among her things was a letter in delicate French. You were the wildest piece I ever found. No signature, no date, only that single confession. The woman who made the world fall in love had loved only once and spent a lifetime keeping it sacred. 11. Peter Lawford. Peter Lawford was born into elegance, the kind that photographs can't fake. He was the English gentleman who mastered the Hollywood accent, the actor who moved between cocktails and conspiracies with the same smooth ease. In the golden glow of the 50s, he stood at the crossroads of power and pleasure, Frank Sinatra on one side, the Kennedys on the other. But beneath the laughter, the Rat Pack bravado, and the flashbulbs, there was a stillness in him, a distance that no one could name. Peter Lawford, the man who had everything, was quietly in love with someone the world could never know. He met her in London, a British intelligence officer whose life was built on secrets. She was older, poised, her voice a whisper of authority. They met under the cover of normalcy, two strangers sitting too long over coffee in a rain-soaked cafe. He once told her that her silence was the most dangerous thing he'd ever fallen for. She laughed and said, "Then you finally found your match." When he returned to Los Angeles, they kept their world alive through coded letters. Packages arrived with film scripts that weren't really scripts, margins filled with invisible ink, names disguised as movie characters. Sometimes she'd send him a lighter, engraved with the words, "My reckless man." It became his talisman, the one thing he kept when everything else slipped away. Rumors would later swirl whispers of espionage, of secrets passed through pillow talk. But those who knew him said it wasn't politics that bound them, it was loneliness. He found in her a kind of safety. No party, no spotlight, no Kennedy could give him. When Lawford's fame began to crumble, when the calls stopped coming and the parties moved on, the lighter still arrived every Christmas. After his death, broke and fading into memory, a woman in black stood alone at the back of his funeral. She left a single envelope on his coffin. Inside, a photograph. Two people in London, laughing in the rain. On the back, in neat handwriting, "You were my favorite secret." The tabloids called him a playboy. History called him a footnote. But maybe the truth was simpler. Peter Lawford was just a man who, for a brief, impossible moment, found love in a world that only wanted performance. 10. Rita Moreno. Rita Moreno lived her life beneath two spotlights, one that adored her and one that judged her. The first Latina woman to conquer Hollywood, Broadway, and television, she carried the weight of an industry that wanted her brilliance but not her truth. Every award, every ovation, was another mask she had to wear. Yet in the quiet spaces between curtain calls, Rita was not an icon, she was just a woman, still searching for a place to rest her heart. After her public, chaotic affair with Marlon Brando, she swore she'd never fall again. But life had its own script. During a Broadway revival in New York, she met a director whose calm disarmed her. He wasn't dazzled by fame or beauty. He was drawn to the strength she tried to hide. In rehearsal, they barely spoke, yet every glance carried a tension that felt like déjà vu. One evening, after a late curtain, he walked her home in the rain. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. Something had already begun. Their affair existed in the space between scenes, in notes left on stage props, whispered goodnights in dark hallways, and letters written in pencil so they could be erased. He was married, she was guarded, and both knew how fragile a secret can be in a world built on exposure. For years they lived in fragments, a weekend away, a phone call from a payphone, a hand held under a table while the world clapped for someone else. When his marriage finally ended, Rita told him not to leave his family for her. "We were never meant for daylight," she said. He understood. And yet, every opening night, a white lily appeared in her dressing room. No note, no name, just the scent of something once real. Decades later, when an interviewer asked if she'd ever been in love, Rita paused, her eyes softening. "Once," she said, "but it was a story without an ending." The audience never knew it. But behind the woman who broke barriers was another kind of courage, the kind it takes to love deeply and let it stay hidden. 9. Natalie Cole. Natalie Cole was born into a legend she could never escape. The daughter of Nat King Cole, she inherited a name made of velvet and expectation. Her voice shimmered with grace, but behind the elegance, there was a restlessness she carried quietly, the need to be loved, not for who her father was, not for the legacy she bore, but for who she had become after surviving herself. In the late 80s, when the world celebrated her comeback, Natalie's life was a balancing act between redemption and loneliness. The cameras followed her every note, but no one saw the man sitting behind the piano during rehearsals, a jazz musician with kind eyes and calloused hands, a man who understood music better than fame. He never chased the spotlight. He just listened. She once said, half joking, "He plays like he's afraid to wake me." Their connection grew in quiet corners, shared cups of coffee during sound checks, late-night drives through Los Angeles, when the air still smelled like rain. He wrote her melodies. She turned them into confessions. Together, they created songs too intimate to release. When she asked why, he smiled and said, "Some music isn't meant for strangers." Their love was gentle, almost invisible, and that was its protection. Natalie knew what publicity could do. It could twist tenderness into headlines. So she kept him hidden, a secret harmony in the background of her fame. He followed her tours from the shadows, always near but never in the photographs. After she died, among her sheet music was a folder labeled "Quiet Storm." Inside were handwritten lyrics no one had ever heard. One line stood out, "You loved me before the applause," and after it stopped. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. The melody still lingers in the air of every love song she ever sang, proof that even in a world built on performance, Natalie Cole found a love too real to perform. 8. Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke's voice sounded like forgiveness, smooth, golden, and eternal. It carried both gospel and rebellion, the ache of an entire generation yearning for something better. He was the bridge between church and sin, between prayer and protest. But beyond the microphone, behind the silk suits and calm smile, Sam Cooke carried a secret that no record label could spin a love too dangerous for the headlines, too sacred for survival. It began quietly, as most forbidden things do. In a small Los Angeles jazz club, sometime before the world knew his name, Sam met her, a writer and civil rights activist, married, fearless, with eyes that could turn conviction into comfort. She challenged him. He once told a friend, "She doesn't hear my music, she hears what I'm trying not to say." Their love existed in the space between danger and devotion. When he toured the South, she would appear at the back of his shows, never clapping, just watching. They couldn't meet openly. The times wouldn't allow it. A black man in love with a white woman could lose everything: his career, his voice, even his life. So they built their world out of fragments: midnight phone calls, motel rooms under borrowed names, and verses hidden in his lyrics. One night, she handed him a folded napkin with a single line written in ink, "You are the song they'll never let you finish." He carried it in his jacket pocket until the day he died. When Sam Cooke was killed in 1964, the official story never made sense. But those who knew him swore that napkin was still with him, crumpled and blood-stained. The police dismissed it as irrelevant. History erased her name. Yet years later, a woman in a black veil visited his grave and left a rose wrapped in sheet music, the melody of "A Change Is Gonna Come." The world remembers Sam Cooke as the man who gave hope a voice. But maybe his most human act wasn't the song he sang. It was the love he hid. Somewhere between the verses and the silence, she still exists. The unfinished lyric of a man who changed the world but couldn't save his own heart. 7. Dorothy Parker. Dorothy Parker laughed so the world wouldn't hear her break. In the smoke-filled bars of Manhattan, she was a goddess of wit, a voice like whiskey, words like knives. Men adored her, editors feared her, and no one could outdrink or outthink her. But behind every sharp line and cruel joke was a woman who was tired of pretending that cleverness was the same as courage. She could outright anyone except her own heart. In the early 30s, when her fame was burning brightest, Dorothy met him, a book editor from Chicago, quiet, married, a man whose sentences were as spare as hers were sharp. He saw through the armor immediately. "You don't laugh," he told her one night. "You hide." She pretended not to hear, but he was right. Their love began in letters, long, literate confessions, disguised as drafts. She'd write at dawn, when the world was still hungover, pouring her loneliness into envelopes, addressed only with the letter E. They met once a month in borrowed apartments or dim hotel rooms, talking about poetry and politics, about the loneliness of being too awake in a sleeping world. He edited her verses, never asking for credit, never demanding her time. It wasn't passion that bound them, but recognition: two broken mirrors, reflecting the same wound. When he died suddenly in 1938, Dorothy was at a cafe in New York, reading his latest letter. The ink was still fresh when she realized it would be the last. She didn't cry. She ordered another drink and told the waiter a joke she couldn't finish. Later, at his funeral, she stood in the back, wearing black, refusing to speak. Years later, after her own death, a small box was found among her things. Inside were postcards, all from Chicago. The last one said only, "Still laughing." Dorothy Parker built her legend out of irony. But her secret, the one she never let the world ruin, was tenderness. She didn't fear heartbreak, she feared being understood. And somewhere, between her laughter and her loneliness, that man did both. 6. Alan Rickman. Alan Rickman spoke like velvet, hiding a blade, every word deliberate, every silence heavier than speech. The world adored his villains, his professors, his poets, never realizing that behind those patient eyes was a man devoted to privacy, to quiet, to love in its purest, most secret form. He carried mystery not as performance but as armor, and when the lights dimmed, the man behind Severus Snape and Colonel Brandon returned to something infinitely smaller and infinitely more real. Before Hollywood claimed him, before Die Hard made his name echo across continents, he was just another actor in London, rehearsing in half-empty theaters. That was where he met her, a woman from the stage, brilliant and soft-spoken, whose laughter filled the quiet corners between rehearsals. Their connection was wordless, unhurried. He never confessed. He didn't need to. Their conversations lingered like a held breath, built on what they didn't say. She wasn't his wife. He never intended her to be. She was the person who saw him when he wasn't performing. Sometimes, late at night, he'd walk her home through the rain-soaked streets of West End, their hands brushing like an accident. Neither wanted to stop. When they parted, he'd quote Shakespeare under his breath. "I know no ways to mince it in love, but directly to say I love you." She'd smile and whisper, "Then don't." They drifted apart when fame found him, but their thread never broke. Every year she sent him a small letter, no greeting, no signature, just a quote from whatever play they'd once performed together. He kept them all in a drawer labeled personal. When illness came, he read them again, one by one, until the paper wore thin. After his death, among his belongings, his wife found an unopened envelope. Inside was a note in that same familiar handwriting. "You taught me that kindness can whisper." Alan Rickman never explained himself, and maybe he didn't have to. His whole career was a study in restraint of saying everything without ever raising his voice. And perhaps that's why this secret stayed hidden. Because some love stories aren't meant for applause. They belong to the quiet, to the spaces between scenes, to the man who always knew how to disappear gracefully. 5. Jean Seberg. Jean Seberg looked like innocence and rebellion caught in the same frame. The girl from Iowa with the French haircut, the American who became the soul of European cinema, she was the face of freedom in Breathless, yet she lived a life that was anything but. Her beauty was light, her story, shadow. Behind the soft voice and fearless eyes was a woman who loved like she acted, without safety, without rehearsal, and without forgiveness from the world that destroyed her. In the late 1960s, at the height of her fame, Jean met Hakim Jamal, an activist and thinker whose voice carried the kind of truth Hollywood feared. Their connection began in quiet defiance, long conversations about justice, loneliness, and the absurd theater of celebrity. What started as admiration turned into something deeper, a love that crossed borders, colors, and ideologies. She didn't care about the headlines. She cared about the man who made her feel seen in a world that only photographed her. The affair enraged those in power. The FBI launched a campaign to destroy her, planting stories that she was pregnant by a member of the Black Panther Party, a lie designed to humiliate her. It worked. The press feasted on her pain, publishing intimate details of her private life with the cruelty of a public execution. When her baby died prematurely, Jean blamed herself, but deep down, she knew the world had killed her innocence long before. She fled back to Paris, where she lived like a ghost, flitting between cheap apartments and unanswered phone calls. Friends said she never spoke his name again, but sometimes she'd leave a candle burning near the window, even during the day, as if signaling someone who'd lost their way. When her body was found in 1979, inside her car, the police called it suicide. But beside her was a note in French, "Forgive me, I can no longer live with my nerves exposed." And tucked between the pages of a worn notebook was a faded photograph, a man with kind eyes, smiling. Jean Seberg died at 40, but her story never stopped haunting the city she loved. The world remembers her for her films, her scandal, her fall. But those who look closer in her eyes, in her silences, will find something else entirely, a woman who dared to love in the open, even when the world demanded she hide. 4. Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen didn't walk, he prowled. Every step was measured, every glance calculated, as if he were always one heartbeat away from running. Hollywood called him the king of cool, but cool was only a disguise, a mask carved from fear and freedom in equal measure. Beneath the sunglasses and the engines and the impossible silences lived a man who trusted almost nothing, especially love. And yet, somewhere between the open road and the roaring of machines, he found it. Her name was Lucia. No last name, no biography, just a woman with paint on her hands and sunlight in her hair. She lived in a small town near the Mexican border, where McQueen sometimes disappeared between films not to hide, but to breathe. She didn't care about movies. She cared about engines, color, quiet mornings. When he arrived at her house, she'd be barefoot, painting in the garden. He'd sit on the porch, polishing his motorcycle, while she hummed songs he didn't recognize. For once, there were no cameras, just air and heat, and her laughter spilling into the desert. They were never official. He was married, restless, built from fire and flight. She was patient, unbothered by his disappearances, but the connection clung to him, fragile and eternal. Friends said he'd write her letters in Spanish, his handwriting rough and uneven, signing them simply, "Tu hombre silencioso," your quiet man. When his illness came, he asked to spend his final days in Mexico, far from the press, far from pity. He told his nurse he wanted to see the sky one more time, the same sky he'd once watched from Lucia's porch. On the morning he died, a small wooden box sat by his bed. Inside, a Polaroid of a woman smiling in front of a half-finished painting, the edges sun-faded and warm. Steve McQueen spent his life outrunning everything fame, pain, and death itself. But love, that one reckless engine he could never control, followed him all the way to the finish line. Somewhere in the desert, maybe that painting still exists, waiting in the heat-proof that even the coldest man in Hollywood once burned for something real. 3. Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead didn't enter a room she arrived. Smoke trailed her like a royal train. Laughter followed her like thunder. She was wild, scandalous, brilliant, a woman who didn't just break rules but forgot they ever existed. The headlines called her outrageous. Her friends called her unforgettable. But no one, not even the gossip columnists who made her famous, knew the one secret she carried through decades of decadence, a love she never dared to claim. In the early 30s, when her name lit Broadway marquees in gold, Tallulah met a playwright whose words were sharper than hers, a woman who could wound her with honesty and heal her with silence. They met at a dinner party where Tallulah was performing even off stage, charming everyone in the room except her. When their eyes met, the performance collapsed. Later that night, over martinis and cigarette smoke, the playwright asked, "Doesn't it exhaust you to be adored?" Tallulah smiled and said, "Only when it isn't real." Their affair was a rebellion against everything the world expected. They hid in dressing rooms, wrote each other coded telegrams, escaped to beach houses where Tallulah could finally speak without an audience. In public, they were collaborators, working on a play that was never finished. In private, they were something no script could contain. But Hollywood was a cruel witness. The whispers grew louder, the studio executives began to threaten. the playwright married a man to survive. Tallulah threw a party for her wedding, toasted her with champagne, and disappeared for 3 days. When she returned, her jokes were sharper, her laughter louder, armor forged from heartbreak. Years later, when the world began to forget her, visitors said she often wore a small silver locket, always tucked beneath her blouse. Inside, instead of a photo, was a scrap of paper yellowed with age. In her handwriting, just 7 words. "You were the only line I meant." Tallulah Bankhead built her legend on provocation and performance. But the truth, the one she protected even from herself, was simpler. Beneath the glitter and chaos, she had loved once, quietly and completely. And for a woman who lived every day like an opening night, that silence was her bravest act. 2. Harry Belafonte. Harry Belafonte carried dignity the way others carried fame effortlessly, like breath. His voice wasn't just melody, it was protest, prayer, and promise all at once. He sang the world awake with Day-O and marched it toward conscience with Martin Luther King Jr. But even a man who stood so boldly in the light needed a place where he could hide. For Belafonte, that hiding place was love, the kind that existed in silence, unrecorded, unacknowledged, yet utterly true. In the early 1960s, between rallies and performances, he met her, a journalist from Mississippi, covering the civil rights movement. She was young, white, and unflinchingly brave, the kind of woman who asked dangerous questions in dangerous places. He noticed her before a march, scribbling notes on a torn notebook while soldiers shouted. Later, she would recall that he looked at her not like a celebrity, but like a man stunned to be understood. Their connection unfolded in the quiet spaces between chaos in motel hallways where fear hung in the air, in train rides where their hands brushed beneath newspapers, in hotel rooms with curtains drawn tight against a world that would never forgive them. She once wrote, "He loved like a secret, beautiful, necessary, and fleeting." They couldn't be public. The stakes were too high. A rumor could ruin both of them, a black icon of resistance and a white Southern reporter. And yet, for years, they exchanged letters that crossed oceans and decades. He called her "my magnolia ghost." She sent him magnolia blossoms pressed between the pages of her notebooks. Every time one arrived, he'd smile quietly and say, "She still remembers the song." When she married someone else and left the country, Belafonte never spoke her name again. But every April, a letter would arrive from London. No return address, no words inside, just a single white flower. In his later years, when asked about his greatest love, he gave a small, knowing smile and said, "Some songs are too honest to sing." Harry Belafonte died a hero, a voice, a symbol, a movement. But in the hush, after his final applause, somewhere across the sea, a woman probably opened a box of old letters, still smelling faintly of magnolia, and listened to the silence where his voice used to be. 1. Ingrid Bergman. Ingrid Bergman moved through the world like a secret written in light. Her face defined purity, her voice carried gravity, and her scandal nearly broke Hollywood in two. But after the exile, after the redemption, after all the tears and apologies, she kept one part of her story untouched, a quiet, invisible love, too fragile to survive the noise of fame. In the late 1950s, while filming in Paris, she met him, a French cinematographer who didn't care who she had been. He never called her Ingrid Bergman, only Ingrid. To him, she wasn't a goddess or a scandal, just a woman learning to live again. He showed her the city through a lens of ordinary beauty, rain on cafe windows, boats under gray skies, the light between takes. They would walk for hours along the Seine, saying little, letting the world shrink until it belonged only to them. He filmed her once, secretly, on black and white stock, no makeup, no direction, just her face turning toward the light. When he showed it to her, she cried. "That's the only time I've seen myself," she said. Their affair was quiet, almost holy in its discretion. She would send him letters written on hotel stationery, signing each with a small sketch of an iris, her favorite flower. He'd respond with film reels, a minute long, each one labeled with a single word, home, peace, breath. When her health began to fail, she returned to Paris one last time. They met for coffee in a small corner café near Montparnasse. He held her hand, and she told him, "You were the part I didn't act." Then she left, walking into the gray morning, scarf fluttering, head high. After her death in 1982, a sealed envelope was delivered to a small apartment in Paris. Inside was a still photograph Ingrid by a window, light spilling over her face, and a note that said, "For the man who saw me without a script." The world remembers Ingrid Bergman as a saint, a sinner, a star reborn. But the man who loved her remembers something far simpler, that once, for a brief and perfect moment, the most watched woman on earth finally stopped performing. When the lights faded and the applause turned to silence, these 15 stars were no longer legends, they were human. They loved in whispers, in shadows, in the thin space between fame and oblivion. The world saw their faces 1,000 times, but never the one they saved for the person who truly knew them. How many stories died when they did? How many letters were burned, names erased, memories folded into drawers no one ever opened again? They gave us performances that lasted forever, but the love they protected was fleeting, fragile, and real. Maybe that's why these secrets still haunt us, because somewhere between the real and the truth, we see ourselves the parts we never dare to show, the words we never say aloud. In the end, even Hollywood's brightest lights fade. But love, the kind that hides and survives, that never really does,